Yo, what's up guys, it's Dynamics here. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're bringing you part 3 of my programming drums tutorial. Forgive me that it's taken so long to bring this. I had a lot of things going on and I just couldn't dedicate the time I needed to get this finished for you. But today, here it is. I ask that you have the patience to stick with me on this tutorial. In order for me to deliver the information, it requires a certain level of patience, so this is not a quick fix tutorial vid. If you need to follow along, feel free to pick it up at a different time. You don't have to watch the whole thing through. But if you do, wicked. Alright, now before we get into it, please make sure that you like and subscribe. But other than that, let's get into it. Okay, so we're back into the session. Now we're going to start listening back to the break. We're going to start adding some extra effects. Now, the tip that I'll give you at this point is where your approach is going to be in context to the tune that you're working on. So by the time you've made these foundational layers and these basic steps that we've gone through, it's time to start introducing some other sounds into your session. Now, whether that's just going to be some kind of atmospheric sample of some kind, whatever's going to get the creative juices going. But what we are going to want to work against is some kind of bass line. It doesn't need to be necessarily the final thing that you're going to work with for the tune, but what it's going to do is help give us the balance, because obviously in this particular example, and generally most examples, we're making drum and bass, so those are the meat and potatoes of the genre, drums and bass. If we continue working forward, we might kind of process into a territory that isn't necessarily usable for maybe what we've intended. So by having some kind of melodic and bassline reference to work with, we then know what movements we need to make to our drums to get them to where we want to be. Okay, so let's get into it, and we're going to play the break back, alright, just on its own, and then we're going to start bringing these musical elements, and then we're going to work through some of these effect steps, okay? Okay, so what I chose was a particular vocal sample. It would just had enough sort of vibe to it that I thought it would be useful for this session. So let's bring it in. Okay, so now we've got a bit of an atmosphere, feeling a little bit of a vibe. It's cool, liking how it sounds. Now, let's bring in the bass. Okay, we're rolling now. So the first thing that I could hear once I started this was like, okay, I want that snare to be a little bit more snappy and just cut through the mix a bit more. So what I've done is I've added on riff distortion. And what I did was I applied the clipping mode. So if you step through, you hit this red button, you get clipping. I went with linked, so both the shapes move in unison. I've gone with vertex and soft, and I've applied about 0.72. Then what I've done is I've gone through, if you're on this part here, flick over and you go into the filter. And what I did, if you listen to without the bass line, and I'll just turn off the other processing on the other snare for a sec. Now listen to the top end of the snare. So this little tiny 6% of resonance is just adding a little bit of sizzle up the top in conjunction with the distortion, bit of clipping, and the sound of it running into the filter, which has got an 18 kilohertz cutoff. It just gave it this nice sizzle. Completely different way of working rather than using an EQ, right? And I know that I'm safe, like I'm clipping it, so I'm not going to be adding too much on the top, but I'm bringing out more harmonics. The second thing I did was with the snare top, it's a similar approach. So I've added in 0.26% with the resin and the pulse mode. Same thing, I've got hard clipping on, and then I use this howl, but I've got 42% on. See, if you listen to it like that, it kind of makes it sound a bit weird, a bit unnatural from what it was. So I've dropped it down the mix. I felt about 46% was about right. Now, if we get both of these and A/B it, see, it's now real dull. And that just gives it a nice bit of bright punch and spark. And then what I've done over here with this particular hi-hat is I've tracked this in just to kind of show you guys a bit of a trick, because remember that I had everything in mono and I processed it down to mono, so everything's going dead through the center. So I was like, this would be a good trick to show you guys. It's a real simple one, and it's a great way of bringing some stereo information back. Now remember that I've got all of those different buses rolling into their rooms. So those reverb rooms are adding space and a bit of width, but we've still got a real clear-cut mono signal, which is good because it's just going to cut through the speakers. Now, with this hi-hat, I'll just isolate it, and I'll bring up the analyzer so you can have a look at it. So let's play this hi-hat. See, we're just straight in the center. Now what you can do is you can use a delay that, provided you can control the left and the right independently, and we're using essentially the Haas Effect. So if you turn it on, what's going on here? Oh, the mix is all the way down. There we go. So what's happening is we've got this left and right information. You notice when it's off, it comes back to center. And we've got now a little bit more stereo width. So what you do is you unlink the left and the right. You keep one side pretty much down on 0.1 milliseconds, so very little delay. And then you sort of add about 2.5 to 3.5 milliseconds on the other side. So what they're doing is they're hitting like slightly after one another, so we're switching the phase a little bit. But then what I'm also using is the mix, so I'm still maintaining a little bit of that original center signal, so that just gives us a bit of spread. Right, now what I want to do is I want to get these other hats, and I want to show you how you can use mono but create a sense of stereo without actually getting into sort of weird phase problems. So let's bring the bass lines back in. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through my various hi-hats. I'm going to keep the original one straight in the center, and then these other ones I'm just going to simply pan them. So what we'll do is we'll switch into pan mode. And I'm going to draw this one left a little bit, maybe to about 20. Switch channels, bring it back to pan, bring this one right, and we'll carry on. Do the same thing. I'm just going to bring this one a little bit wider, maybe 24. And then move this one in the other direction. Actually, it's not open hi-hat. I'm going to keep that center and keep like that. So now we've got this like little bit of movement between the hats, and it makes a really big difference between the sense of spread, but we're not actually adding in any stereo information. We're just making use of the stereo field left and right. Real simple trick. You can maintain a really good cut through the mix, and it just sounds bigger and wider. And then of course we're bussing through our auxiliary channels, so we've got a bit of spatial width going on in there. So not much processing at this point here. And then what I've done on the second open hi-hat, you'll you'll see I put a little note. So one thing I can do inside of Studio One is you've got this section where you can actually add notes. So if you're working on your track and you're like, oh, I want to do something for the next time you come back to the session, you can actually just come into the bottom of the channel and write the note in there and then go, oh yeah, that's what I wanted to do, rather than trying to remember what next moves you wanted to make. It's a really good way to work. Okay, so what I've done with this second open hi-hat is I added on just a delay. I've got a quarter dotted, I've got it ping-ponging, I've got the mix down only at 16%, I've cut out the lows, applied some saturation, a bit of high cut, and the feedback's at about 36%. But it's also got this here, the modulation source, which is the filter. And what I've done is I've put it on a time section. You can change the timing by clicking here. So you can either have it at hertz or you can have it at, ratios. But what I've done is chosen the low pass filter. I've selected a resonance I've wanted, and I've moved the cutoff. So what it's doing is it's moving over the time that I've designated over here and bringing the cutoff down. Now, one real cool trick that you can do with sound, using a low pass, like a low pass filter, especially like a 6 dB low pass filter, just really mildly shaves off the tops. But what the effect of doing this is as you slide across sounds, it creates a sense of pushing something back. So you can create this sense of things that are up front moving backwards. So by adding a delay and then having a low pass filter, I'm sort of getting it to jump up, but rather than it staying bright in the same signal and just repeating, I'm sort of pushing it back. And again, remember I said originally in part one, you've got things like contrast and space, and these all make a huge difference in how something sounds. So I've got that running, and just to let you hear how it sounds isolated. All right, so it's just short. You get like 3 hits. All right, but in the context of the whole drum group, it just adds a bit of extra vibe to it. And remember, this was that open hi-hat that sounded kind of a little bit SFX sounding. I'll turn it off. And on. And what I'd probably do is, if I was working on a track, I'd probably duplicate this open hi-hat, and I'd keep one without the reverb, and then I'd have one that hits with the reverb, just so I've got a bit more variation. So what I could do here now, just to show you an example, I've made the move I wanted, so I can get rid of that note, but I can say duplicate, can't spell, duplicate, and make one without reverb. And because I've written that, I'll know exactly what that means. Okay, so the other thing which I've done here is in the perk. So I'm just adding a bit of distortion. I've used the D16 Devastator 2. It's a real grunty distortion unit. And I've just added that to lift out the perk more. Going to bring the channel down a bit. Nice. So to give you So what I did is as I made these moves, I added in a couple of things as I was bringing these sounds in, and I had something to work against. So I was like, oh yeah, we're going to need a crash. So I added in a crash to help with phrasing. And what I also did was I got this amen that I'd chopped up and processed in another session. But what I've done to it, if I isolate it on its own, cool, pretty standard amen. And what I've done is I've just done a high pass on it so that it doesn't interfere with all the other low information in the drum break. I don't want it to take away from my drums or be overbearing. And then what I did was I used the kilohertz trance gate. I love this thing. And I've just tweaked the parameters to make it choppy. So now what the amen's doing is this. So that's just slid into the mix on the end of the phrase to help things move along, and then that slides into the crash, and then we start to bring in these other elements. So I'll keep the track playing along, and I'll talk about some other movements I've made in the buses. So on the hi-hats, I listened back on my monitors without my headphones on, which is how I usually mix, and everything was sounding quite bright and harsh. So I just added the Soothe 2 to it, and what that's doing is it's taking out the harshness in the tops. If I take it off, you'll be able to hear that those hi-hats become really bright and really present. And it sounds okay to me on my headphones, but in my monitoring situation, it was just a little bit too much. So I've just done a bit of a tweak there to tame that out. And all of these moves we can easily tweak as well. The same thing I've done with the perk. The perk, after having some distortion added to it, just got a little bit crunchy and bright up top, which is pretty common. So again, just using Soothe to tame it out. And then what I did was I also created a quick bass group. And what I'm doing, and I do this a lot in my tracks, it's a golden tip for you guys, is I use Soothe 2 as my sidechain. So rather than, say, automating volume or splitting the sub-frequencies from the bass and applying a sidechain compression in there or whatever, I just use Soothe. And generally that does the trick really well. So my input is obviously my 2 kick drums, and they're just pushing down on that low end area. So I've got my high pass, low pass filter on Soothe. So every time you'll see that the kick triggers, it's just pushing down, and it's pushing down about 6 dB out of the bass line. Now, if you wanted to, you could then take what you've done here. So we've got all of our auxiliary sends, our drum room space, so to speak, and that's feeding into the respective isolated parts of the kick bus, snare bus, hi-hat bus, etc., etc. Now, what I can do is I can process that a step further, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a separate auxiliary for all the parts. So, how it works is we select them all, we add in effects, and I'm going to call this drum crunch. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is create another bus, and I'm going to call this drum sum. So it's the sum of all parts. Oh my gosh, my typing sucks today. Anyway, so as you can see, these bus channels here for all the different parts are feeding into the drum bus, which is this. Okay. Now I don't want to send the drum crunch out, back, and through to where these are all feeding. What I want to do is control it, isolate it, and sum it all together. So this drum sum is here, and I'm going to go these parts into the drum sum. So all these parts, all roads lead to the drum sum. I hope that makes sense to you guys. So I haven't done this part of the process yet, but I'm just going to play with it just to show you guys what is possible. So let's select the drum sum, sorry, the drum crunch, and let's just put some real gritty distortion or something on it and see what happens. Now what we can do is we can feed that signal into the sum of all parts. Bring the channel volume down. And then it's blended in. So you can get some nice crunch into the tune that way, depending on what you're wanting to do. And another thing that you can do here is, because obviously it creates a lot of shape when you start smashing the drums like this. So one little trick you can do is grab a transient designer. So I'll grab the XLN Audio's DS10 drum shaper, and we'll just turn off the other drums for a second. What's going on here? And we can just bring the sustain a bit down so it's not so abrupt, and we can get that crunch off the top. Or maybe you want to flip it the other way, take the attack off and add a bit of sustain off the back and get that sizzle. It really just depends on how you want to shape your drums. Okay, another thing that we could do, I'll remove that, is we can just do straight New York City style compression. So if we grab a Pro C, we'll chuck it on here, and let's listen to this. And let's just smash it. Put the ratio way up, fast attack, fast release, and then just push. So you start to get some real crazy compression going on. And you can play with the different modes here. I'll go the classic or the octo. Now the octo. Alright, and we'll just bring that down a bit, and then we'll listen to everything together. We'll blend it back in. So I'll bring the channel down. There's our tambourines coming in. Alright, so that helps give us movement through the track. But I quite like what that New York City Compression is doing. So if we go to the drum sum, and we can look under the analyzer, right? Now what I'm doing is I'm looking at the peaks. So there's the peaks of our kick drum, there's the peak of our snare drum. So we're peaking at about 11.5. We've got about a 2B difference at 13.7. And then we've got the tops, the hats and whatnot, hitting about the peak. And that's generally what I look for when I'm balancing my drums. You know, I either get my peak sitting flat, or, you know, I might have a little bit more give in my kick drum. But that tells me that everything's sort of sitting at the right levels. I don't overthink it. And then what I do as I'm working with the track and I'm listening back, I'm making movements. So these are like tiny little movements with the faders. Excuse me. Tiny little movements with the faders as you're listening back and you go, oh yeah, I want to tuck that in a bit more, or I want to push something up a little bit more. So you're making these little sort of tiny micro movements. So think about mixing your drums more like that. So really what you're going to do is you're going to do your fundamental processing. Then you're going to do anything you want to do to spice it up, whether you're going to get really wild with sort of sound design drums or something, or just effects to add flavor and texture to it. And then you'll go, cool, now I'm going to do the final processing where it all rides through those bus channels and into a final sum. And you'll make your little adjustments and movements in context to your mix and the elements with it, because different sounds, you know, when they're playing against each other, are going to call for different mix movements. Okay, so the final thing that we'll do is we'll just do a little quick keep safe on the drums, which is just to check our overall gluing. Now, what we can do is a few different things, but let's just play back the track, and I'm going to make some movements there and we'll see what sounds right. So we'll try some compression on the drum sum. Now, what this sidechain does when it's in internal mode is it's not letting the kick drum be affected by the compression. Obviously, as you can tell when you saw the peaks on the analyzer, if that's punching through, that's going to trigger the threshold and trigger the compression. So we can use this internal sidechain to sort of leave the kick drum out and sort of play with the other parts. Now, I don't always use compression on my drum bus, on my sum, but we'll just do it for an example because I want to show you guys different approaches. So we're just shaving out that kick drum. About there. And we're just going to go in the solo. And I want to turn off auto. And I want to hear the compression. So we're going real extreme. Okay, so you can see here I'm getting like plus 6 dB input gain, so I'm coming in pretty hot now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce my input gain. So on here, on Studio One, I've got an input clip. So I can actually adjust how much input gain comes into a plugin, which is real helpful for gain staging. If you don't have this functionality on your DAW, don't worry, it's all good. Just grab yourself some kind of simple mix tool plugin that allows you to adjust the volume or amplitude coming in. So you would land it on the first part of your signal chain. So you would drop it in at the top, and this is just a simple gain, and I can reduce how much gain is coming in this way, or I can add more depending on what I need to do. So that's what you would use that for, and you just find there's heaps of plugins out there that can do this, or just something in your arsenal that will essentially do the same result without using heaps of CPU. So I'm just going to open up the compression, and I'm going to adjust this input gain. Okay, yeah, so -6 input. But what I'll do is I'll add 6 dB on the other side. So it's still the same, but I'm just not smashing the plugin with the input. Now I can make my movements. I'm looking at my peaks, and I'm going to turn this on again. Okay, so I'm just going to add a little bit back in. You can see it's just mainly catching those snares. And what you can do if you're working with quite fast tempos and things like that, so you can put this look ahead on, and that'll just help compensate for any weird little artifacts that might happen. So that's an option for you, just remember that. Also remember to use look ahead if you're using this compressor for sidechain, because if you're ever hearing like weird crackles and stuff come through on what it's applied to, where the sidechain compression is, it's quite often a result of that. You use the look ahead, it will solve the problem most of the time. Alright, so I'm using my ears right now more than looking at numbers. So I like how it sounds on its own, but let's hear how it sounds with everything else. So that little bit of compression is bringing the life of the drums back and bringing things up to the front. I like the way that it sounds. It sounds a bit more cohesive, and it just brings that whole vibe out in context of everything. I like how that sounds. Okay, so that's one example. Now another example you could use is clipping. So I'm going to turn the compression off, and let's get standard clip. Let's just use that because it's got a nice little bit of visualizer on it. So we've got our input here and we've got output here. And you'll see down here the signal of the drums passing through it. We've got oversampling here, so you can increase your oversampling depending on your application, especially if you're more into like the serious mixing, mastering stage, you might want to increase that up. But let's have a look and listen and see what sounds right. So these little red tips are the clips. Okay, now what we can do is we turn the ceiling on. So we can clip one way, we can clip on the input, like that, or we can just clip into it. So there's the soft clip pro, and what this is going to do is kind of apply soft clipping to the whole signal. So we're clipping on the ceiling. That's really aggressive. Okay, and now let's compare it to the compression option. So a hard clipper is just, you know, shaving harsh across the top. It's just a full flat haircut. Be careful with this though, because you can quite often take away a lot of the power, the dynamics of transients. So use with caution. You can see those big spikes it's catching, right? Soft clip. Hard clip. I like the life that the soft clip brings to the whole group, but I can tell also by looking at the channel that I've still got a lot of gain coming through. Pay attention to the drum sum channel and where the 0 point line in the red happens between soft clip and hard clip. Now hard clip. Soft clip. So you know what? I do like the soft clip, but I also think I'm being tricked a little bit. It is adding a little bit of saturation to it, but what we could do is go back to the soft clip and balance it out and see if it's actually if we're being tricked. Soft clip. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways to go about this part at the end. Clipping's one option, and then finally the other option you could use, which is limiting and using a limiter. This can potentially eat up into your CPU resources, so bear that in mind. But what you're going to want to do when you actually add in limiting is don't be tricked by adding a limiter and things getting louder. So if we put in the Pro L here on the drums and put it in and we push the gain up, the drums are going to get louder. That's not what we want to do. We want to go for this 1-to-1 ratio. So what that's going to do is it's going to apply the limiter, but it's going to keep it relative. Like we're going to have the same volume that we had originally as we started. Play with the different modes, so like aggressive for example, quite good on drums. And the other thing that you can do as well is you can stack them, so you could maybe use hard clip just to catch some of these peaks a bit, and then feed that through into the limiter so that the limiter isn't working as hard. You see before we were getting like 8 decibels of reduction on some of those real peaky transients, and that clip is just catching them. So if you wanted to, you could use a combination of all these things, like a little bit of them all. So we're still at the peak volume. We haven't actually made it louder, but we've got a much greater perceived volume. So I'm going to leave it here for this point in time. I think there's quite a bit of information that's come through. I hope you guys have found it inspiring. I hope you are going to take this information away, apply it yourselves, and make some great music. But as for that, thanks for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'll catch you next time.